The iron shackles bit deep into Margaret Wheeler's wrists as Sheriff Clayton Hartwell dragged her toward the ancient oak that stood at the center of Millbrook's town square. The autumn wind carried the scent of wood smoke and fear through the gathering crowd, but Margaret kept her chin raised, her green eyes blazing with defiance, even as the cold metal pressed against her skin. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is what happens to those who defy the natural order, Hartwell announced, his voice carrying across the square like the crack of a whip. The townspeople pressed closer, some nodding in approval, others shifting uncomfortably as they watched the blacksmith's wife being chained to the tree like a common criminal. But what Sheriff Hartwell didn't know was that Margaret Wheeler had never been common, and what he couldn't have predicted was that her husband, Thomas Wheeler, was already making his way through the crowd, his massive frame cutting through the assembled townspeople like a ship through troubled waters. The tools of his trade hung heavy at his belt, and his dark eyes held a fire that could forge steel or melt the hardest heart. The sheriff was about to learn that some chains were meant to be broken. The morning that changed everything in Millbrook began like any other autumn day in 1847. Margaret Wheeler rose before dawn, as was her custom, to tend to the small garden behind the blacksmith shop she shared with her husband Thomas. The tomatoes were nearly finished for the season, but the squash still held promise, and she worked methodically among the plants, her calloused hands gentle despite years of hard labor. Thomas was already at his forge, the rhythmic hammering of metal on metal serving as the town's unofficial sunrise bell. Their life together had settled into comfortable routines over the past 8 years of marriage, but comfort had never meant complacency for Margaret. While other women in Millbrook occupied themselves with quilting circles and gossip, Margaret had taught herself to read and write, devouring every book that passed through their small town. She kept a journal, wrote letters for neighbors who couldn't manage the task themselves, and had even begun teaching some of the local children their letters on Sunday afternoons. It was this last activity that would soon bring Sheriff Clayton Hartwell to their door. Margaret had noticed that many of the children in Millbrook's poorer families never attended the formal school, which charged fees their parents couldn't afford. The schoolmaster, Cornelius Ashford, was a thin, bitter man who seemed to take pleasure in turning away children whose families couldn't pay. So Margaret had quietly begun offering lessons in the back room of the blacksmith shop, teaching basic reading and arithmetic to any child whose parents would allow it. Among her students was a young girl named Sarah, whose father worked as a day laborer for the wealthy landowner Preston Blackwood. Sarah was quick and eager to learn, but she was also mixed race, the daughter of a white mother and a black father. In the rigid social hierarchy of Millbrook, this made her education not just unusual, but controversial. Sheriff Hartwell had been watching Margaret's activities with growing suspicion for weeks. A man who believed firmly in maintaining what he called proper order, Hartwell saw Margaret's teaching as a dangerous disruption to the way things had always been done. When he learned that she was teaching a mixed-race child alongside white children, his disapproval hardened into something closer to rage. The confrontation came on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. Margaret was in the middle of a lesson, helping young William Mason sound out words from a worn copy of McGuffey's Reader, when the door to the blacksmith shop burst open. Sheriff Hartwell strode in, his badge gleaming on his chest and his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Margaret Wheeler," he said, his voice carrying the weight of official authority, "you'll come with me." The children around the makeshift table looked up in alarm. Margaret felt her heart begin to race, but she kept her voice steady. "Sheriff Hartwell, as you can see, I'm in the middle of conducting a lesson. Perhaps you could return at a more convenient time?" "There won't be any more lessons," Hartwell replied, stepping further into the room. His eyes swept over the assembled children with obvious distaste. "You're corrupting these children with ideas above their station, and I won't have it in my town." Margaret stood slowly, placing herself between the sheriff and her students. "Education is hardly corruption, Sheriff. These children have as much right to learn as any others. Not all children are created equal, Mrs. Wheeler, and it's time you learned that lesson yourself." Hartwell's voice carried a dangerous edge. "You've been filling their heads with nonsense about reading and writing, making them think they're something they're not. It stops today." From the main room of the shop came the sound of hammer strikes suddenly ceasing. Thomas had heard the raised voices, and Margaret knew he would be listening carefully to every word. The thought gave her courage. "These children learn because they want to learn," she said firmly. "I won't apologize for helping them better themselves." "Better themselves?" Hartwell's laugh was harsh and humorless. "Look around you, woman. This is a blacksmith shop, not some fancy academy. These children need to learn their place in the world, not get ideas that will only lead to disappointment and trouble." Little Sarah, who had been sitting quietly at the end of the table, suddenly spoke up. "Mrs. Wheeler, what does place mean?" The innocence of the question seemed to inflame Hartwell further. He pointed a thick finger at the child. "It means you belong where God put you, girl, and it's not sitting at the same table as your betters." Margaret felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. "Sheriff Hartwell, I think you should leave. These children are under my protection, and I won't have them spoken to in such a manner." "Your protection?" Hartwell's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "You seem to have forgotten that I represent the law in this town, Mrs. Wheeler, and the law says that what you're doing here is disturbing the peace and corrupting the moral order of our community." "What law?" Margaret demanded. "Show me the statute that says a woman cannot teach children to read." The challenge clearly caught Hartwell off guard. He was accustomed to people backing down when he invoked his authority, not demanding specifics. His face darkened as he struggled to find a response. "There are laws about maintaining public order," he said finally. "About preventing the spread of dangerous ideas that might incite unrest. What you're doing here threatens the stability of our community." "Teaching children their letters threatens stability?" Margaret's voice carried a note of incredulity. "How exactly does literacy endanger Millbrook, Sheriff?" The sound of heavy footsteps announced Thomas's arrival before he appeared in the doorway. Margaret's husband was an imposing man, tall and broad-shouldered from years of working the forge. His clothes were stained with soot and his hands blackened with coal dust, but his presence immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. "Is there a problem here?" Thomas asked, his deep voice calm, but carrying an undertone that suggested he was prepared for whatever answer he might receive. Sheriff Hartwell straightened, clearly reassessing the situation now that he was facing both husband and wife. "Your wife has been conducting illegal activities in your establishment, Wheeler. I'm here to put a stop to it." Thomas looked at Margaret, then at the children still seated around the table with their books and slates. His gaze returned to the sheriff with obvious confusion. "Illegal activities? You mean the reading lessons?" "I mean the corruption of impressionable young minds with ideas that go against the natural order of things," Hartwell replied. "Your wife has been teaching these children to think they're equal, to reach above their proper station in life. It's causing unrest in the community." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying the sheriff's face. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and careful. "Sheriff, I've lived in this town for 15 years. I've shod your horses, repaired your tools, and never given you cause for complaint. My wife teaches children to read because she believes education is a good thing. I fail to see how that constitutes a crime." "The crime," Hartwell said, his voice rising, "is in teaching them to forget their place. There's an order to things, Wheeler, and when that order is disrupted, chaos follows. Your wife is planting seeds of discontent that will grow into something much worse if they're not stopped now." Margaret stepped forward, her hands clenched at her sides. "The only discontent I see, Sheriff, is your own. These children are happy to learn. Their parents are grateful for the opportunity, and no one has complained except you." "No one has complained because they're afraid to speak up," Hartwell shot back. "But I've heard the whispers, seen the looks. People are concerned about what you're doing here, about the example you're setting. When word gets out that you're teaching white children alongside—" He gestured dismissively towards Sarah, who shrank back in her chair. "Alongside what?" Margaret's voice was dangerously quiet. "Finish your sentence, Sheriff." Hartwell's jaw worked as he seemed to realize. He had said more than he intended. "Alongside children who should be learning different lessons," he finished lamely. Thomas stepped closer to his wife, his presence a solid wall of support. "Sheriff, I think you should explain exactly what law my wife has broken, because if she hasn't broken any law, then I suggest you leave our property immediately." The sheriff's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. He had expected to intimidate Margaret into compliance, not face unified resistance from both husband and wife. The presence of the children as witnesses to his growing frustration only made matters worse. "The law of common decency," he snarled. "The law says certain people have certain roles in society, and it's dangerous to pretend otherwise. Your wife is filling these children's heads with impossible dreams, and when those dreams come crashing down, the whole community will pay the price." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "The only price I see," Thomas said quietly, "is the cost of your prejudice to these children's futures." The words hung in the air like smoke from the forge, heavy and impossible to ignore. Sheriff Hartwell's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon, then stopped as he seemed to remember where he was and who was watching. "You'll regret this defiance, Wheeler," he said finally. "Both of you will regret standing against the proper order of things. This town has ways of dealing with troublemakers, and you've just marked yourselves as exactly that." Margaret felt. Thomas tense beside her, but she placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Sheriff Hartwell," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that was beginning to creep up her spine. "We're not troublemakers. We're simply people who believe that knowledge is a gift that should be shared, not hoarded by those who think themselves superior." "Superior?" Hartwell's laugh was bitter. "Mrs. Wheeler, I am superior. I represent the law, the order, the stability that keeps this community functioning. You represent chaos, the breakdown of everything that makes civilization possible. And I won't let that happen, not in my town." He turned to go, then paused at the door. "You have until tomorrow morning to shut this down permanently. If I find you conducting any more of these lessons, there will be consequences, severe consequences." The door slammed behind him, leaving the room in stunned silence. The children looked up at Margaret with wide, frightened eyes, and she realized that whatever happened next, there was no going back. The line had been drawn, and she and Thomas were on one side, while Sheriff Hartwell and the forces of what he called proper order were on the other. What Margaret didn't know was that Hartwell had already begun planning those consequences he had threatened, and what neither she nor Thomas could have imagined was how far the sheriff was willing to go to maintain his vision of how the world should work. The seeds of the confrontation that would eventually lead to the oak tree in the town square had been planted. Now they would grow in the darkness of prejudice and fear, watered by the determination of those who believed that some people were simply born to be less than others. But Margaret Wheeler had never been one to back down from a fight, especially when that fight was about something as fundamental as the right of children to learn. And Thomas Wheeler, for all his quiet strength, had never been one to let his wife face danger alone. The battle for the soul of Millbrook was just beginning. That evening, Margaret sat at her kitchen table, a cup of cooling tea forgotten beside her journal. The lamplight flickered across the pages as she wrote, her pen scratching steadily against the paper. Thomas worked quietly at the table across from her, mending a bridle that had seen better days, but she could feel his eyes on her every few minutes. "What are you writing?" he finally asked, setting down his leather working tools. Margaret looked up, her green eyes reflecting the warm glow of the lamp. "A record of what happened today, what Sheriff Hartwell said, how he said it, the threats he made." She paused, dipping her pen again. "I have a feeling we're going to need an accurate account of events before this is over." Thomas nodded slowly. In the 8 years they'd been married, he'd learned to trust his wife's instincts. Margaret saw patterns where others saw coincidence, recognized danger where others saw mere disagreement. It was one of the things he loved most about her, though. It sometimes kept him awake at night. "Do you think he'll make good on his threats?" Thomas asked. Margaret set down her pen and looked directly at her husband. "Clayton Hartwell has never been challenged in this town, not once in all the years he's worn that badge. Men like him don't know how to back down when their authority is questioned. Yes, I think he'll try to make good on his threats. The question is how far he's willing to go." A soft knock at the back door interrupted their conversation. Thomas rose carefully, his hand instinctively moving to the heavy iron poker beside the fireplace. Visitors after dark were unusual in Millbrook, and given the day's events, unexpected company could mean trouble. "Mrs. Wheeler." "Mr. Wheeler?" "It's Rebecca Mason." The voice was female, nervous and familiar. Rebecca was William's mother, one of the few townspeople who had openly supported Margaret's teaching efforts. Thomas opened the door to find Rebecca Mason standing in the shadows, her shawl pulled tight against the evening chill. Behind her stood 3 other women Margaret recognized: Helen Curtis, whose daughter Emma was one of her best students, Dorothy Flynn, who cleaned houses for the wealthier families, and Mary Hutchins, the baker's wife. "Please come in," Margaret said, rising from her chair. "What brings you out so late?" The women filed into the kitchen, their faces grave in the lamplight. Rebecca, acting as their spokesperson, wrung her hands nervously before speaking. "Mrs. Wheeler, we heard about what happened today with the sheriff. Word travels fast in a small town." She glanced at the other women, who nodded encouragingly. "We wanted you to know that we support what you're doing for our children. All of us do." Helen. Curtis stepped forward. "My Emma has learned more in the past 2 months than she did in 2 years with that awful Mr. Ashford. You've given her something precious, Mrs. Wheeler. Hope." "The sheriff came to see my husband this afternoon," Dorothy Flynn added, her voice barely above a whisper. "Asked a lot of questions about whether we were satisfied with our children attending your lessons. Made it clear he thought we shouldn't be." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "What did your husband tell him?" "That it wasn't any of the sheriff's business how we chose to educate our children," Dorothy replied, with a spark of defiance. "But Sheriff Hartwell made it clear that he disagreed. He said there would be consequences for families who continued to support what he called inappropriate activities." Thomas stepped closer to the group of women. "What kind of consequences?" Mary Hutchins, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "He visited the bakery this evening, told my husband that families who supported disruptive influences might find it harder to conduct business in town, said the respectable citizens of Millbrook wouldn't want to associate with troublemakers." The implications hung heavy in the small kitchen. In a town like Millbrook, economic pressure could be as devastating as any legal action. If Sheriff Hartwell could convince the wealthier residents to boycott businesses owned by families who supported Margaret's teaching, those families would face genuine hardship. "He's trying to isolate us," Margaret said quietly. "Turn the community against anyone who doesn't fall in line with his vision of how things should be." Rebecca nodded miserably. Some of the other mothers are already getting scared. Mrs. Patterson told me she won't be sending her boys anymore. Said she can't risk her husband's job at the lumber mill." Margaret sank back into her chair, the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. She had known there would be resistance to her teaching, but she hadn't anticipated how quickly that resistance would escalate into threats against the families she was trying to help. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "it would be better if I suspended the lessons for a while, until things calmed down." "No!" The response came simultaneously from all four women, their voices sharp with protest. Helen Curtis leaned forward urgently. "Mrs. Wheeler, you can't let him win. My Emma reads to me now from the Bible and from the newspaper when we can get one. She's teaching her little brother his letters. What you've given our children, it's not something that can be taken away once they have it. But I won't be responsible for your family's suffering because of my stubbornness," Margaret replied. Dorothy Flynn straightened her shoulders. "With all due respect, Mrs. Wheeler, this isn't about your stubbornness. This is about Sheriff Hartwell's belief that some people are worth more than others. If we give in now, what's next? Will he decide our children can't play together? Can't walk on the same streets as the wealthy family's children?" Thomas had been listening quietly, but now he spoke. "The sheriff mentioned young Sarah specifically today, made it clear that his real objection isn't to education itself, but to who's receiving it alongside whom." The women exchanged glances, and Margaret saw understanding dawn in their eyes. They all knew Sarah, had seen how bright and eager she was to learn. The idea that her presence in the lessons was what had triggered Hartwell's crackdown was both heartbreaking and infuriating. "That little girl deserves the same chance as any other child," Mary Hutchins said firmly. "My own grandmother was an indentured servant who couldn't read a word. She always said education was the only thing that could truly free a person." Rebecca Mason nodded. "We've talked about this among ourselves. We know there are risks, but we also know what we're fighting for. Our children's futures matter more than Sheriff Hartwell's prejudices." Margaret looked around the circle of women, seeing determination mixed with fear in their faces. These were not wealthy or powerful people. They were wives of laborers, shopkeepers, and farmers, people who had everything to lose and very little to gain from standing up to the established order. Yet here they were, asking her to continue the very activity that had put them all in danger. "There's something else you should know," Helen Curtis said quietly. "Sheriff Hartwell met with Preston Blackwood this afternoon. Sarah's mother, Anna, works in Mr. Blackwood's house. She overheard part of their conversation. Preston Blackwood owned more land around Millbrook than anyone else, and his opinion carried significant weight in the community. If he was involving himself in the situation, it meant the stakes were higher than Margaret had realized." "What did Anna hear?" Thomas asked. "That Mr. Blackwood is concerned about the precedent being set by the lessons. He told the sheriff that if word got out that mixed children were being educated alongside white children in Millbrook, it could attract the wrong kind of attention from outside the town. People who might come here with ideas about equality and such." Margaret felt her blood grow cold. She had heard stories from other parts of the country, places where tensions over race and social order had erupted into violence. The idea that her simple reading lessons could be seen as a threat to the established way of life was both absurd and terrifying. "Mr. Blackwood suggested that an example needed to be made," Dorothy Flynn added. "Something that would show everyone in town what happens when people try to upset the natural order of things." The kitchen fell silent, except for the soft ticking of the mantel clock. Margaret looked at Thomas, seeing her own fears reflected in his dark eyes. They both understood what making an example could mean in a town where the sheriff and the wealthiest landowner were working together. "We won't abandon you," Rebecca Mason said suddenly. "Whatever happens, you need to know that. We'll find ways to support each other, even if we have to be more careful about how we do it." Over the next hour, The women outlined a plan that was both ingenious and heartbreaking. If Margaret's formal lessons had to stop, they would create an informal network. Children would be taught in different homes on different days, with the location changing regularly to avoid detection. Books would be shared secretly, passed from family to family like contraband. Parents who could read would teach those who couldn't, creating a web of learning that would be much harder for Sheriff Hartwell to dismantle. "It's not ideal," Helen Curtis admitted, "but it's better than letting our children's education end because one man thinks he knows what's best for everyone." As the women prepared to leave, Margaret felt a mixture of pride and dread. Pride in their courage and determination, dread at the lengths they were having to go to protect something as basic as the right to learn. She walked them to the door, embracing each one and promising to let them know her decision about continuing the lessons. After they left, Margaret and Thomas sat in their kitchen, the silence heavy with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Thomas reached across the table and took his wife's hand. "What are you thinking?" he asked. Margaret squeezed his fingers gently. "I'm thinking that Sheriff Hartwell has made a serious miscalculation. He believes that threatening people will make them back down, make them accept his version of how the world should work. But what he's actually done is shown them exactly what they're fighting against." "And what are we fighting against?" Margaret looked toward the window, where the lights of Millbrook twinkled in the darkness. Somewhere out there, children were going to bed with new words in their heads, new possibilities in their hearts. Somewhere else, powerful men were planning to crush those possibilities before they could take root and grow. "We're fighting against the idea that some people matter less than others," she said quietly. "That some children deserve less hope, less opportunity, less of a future simply because of who their parents are or what they look like." Thomas nodded slowly. "It's a fight worth having. Even if it costs us everything?" He was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the same careful deliberation he brought to his work at the forge. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute certainty, especially if it costs us everything, because if we don't fight now, what kind of world are we leaving for the children we're trying to protect? Margaret smiled, the first genuine smile she'd managed since Sheriff Hartwell's visit that afternoon. She had married a good man, a man who understood that some principles were worth any sacrifice. Whatever came next, they would face it together. What neither of them could have known was that at that very moment Sheriff Hartwell was meeting with Preston Blackwood and two other influential men in the back room of Millbrook's only saloon. The example they were planning would be more dramatic and more public than anything Margaret had imagined, and it would test not only her resolve, but the conscience of every person in their small town. The pieces were moving into position for a confrontation that would define Millbrook for generations to come. 3 days passed before Sheriff Hartwell made his next move, but Margaret could feel the tension building like pressure in a steam kettle. The town seemed quieter than usual, conversations stopping abruptly when she walked past, neighbors offering tight smiles instead of their usual friendly greetings. Word of the confrontation had spread through Millbrook like wildfire, and everyone was choosing sides, whether they wanted to or not. Margaret continued her lessons, but now they took place in the back room with the curtains drawn and the door locked. The children sensed the change in atmosphere, their usual chatter subdued, their eyes darting nervously toward the windows. Even young Sarah, normally so bright and talkative, had grown quiet and watchful. It was on a grey Thursday morning that everything changed. Margaret was helping William Mason with his arithmetic when she heard the sound of multiple horses approaching. The blacksmith shop. Thomas's hammer fell silent, and she could hear voices outside. Too many voices, all male, all carrying the authority of official business. "Children, gather your things quickly," she whispered, moving to the window and peering through a gap in the curtains. What she saw made her blood turn cold. Sheriff Hartwell sat astride his black gelding in front of the shop, but he wasn't alone. With him were 4 other men, all wearing deputy badges that gleamed in the pale morning light. She recognized 2 of them. Jacob Morrison, who worked part-time for the sheriff when he wasn't helping his father run their general store, and Carl Brennan, a man known for his quick temper and quicker fists. But it was the presence of the other 2 men that truly frightened her. They were strangers, hard-faced men with the look of professional enforcers. Their guns sat easy in their holsters, and their eyes moved constantly, scanning the area like predators assessing their territory. "Mrs. Wheeler," Hartwell called out, his voice carrying clearly through the morning air. "I know you're in there. Come out and bring those children with you." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her voice steady as she turned to face her students. "Children, I want you to go out the back door, very quietly. Go straight home and don't look back. Can you do that for me?" Emma Curtis raised her small hand. "What about you, Mrs. Wheeler?" "I'll be fine, sweetheart, but I need you to be brave and do as I say, all right?" The children filed out silently, their faces pale with fear. Margaret watched through the back window as they scattered in different directions, running toward their homes like rabbits fleeing a hawk. At least they would be safe. She took a deep breath, smoothed her skirts, and walked through the shop toward the front door. Thomas stood near his forge, a heavy hammer in his hand, his face grim with understanding. They exchanged a look that said everything words couldn't. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. Margaret opened the door and stepped outside, her chin raised despite the fear coursing through her veins. "Sheriff Hartwell, what can I do for you?" "You can start by acknowledging that you've violated a direct order," Hartwell replied, dismounting from his horse. "I told you to cease these illegal educational activities, yet my deputies report that children were seen entering your establishment this morning." "I'm not aware of any law that makes education illegal, Sheriff," Margaret said, her voice carrying across the small crowd that was beginning to gather. "Perhaps you could enlighten me as to which specific statute I violated." One of the unfamiliar deputies snorted with amusement. "Got yourself a real smart mouth, this one," he said to Hartwell. "They always think they're clever with their words and their reading." Hartwell raised a hand to silence his deputy, but Margaret caught the exchange. These men hadn't been hired for their legal expertise. They'd been brought in for intimidation. "Possibly worse. Mrs. Wheeler," Hartwell continued, "you're under arrest for disturbing the peace, corrupting minors, and inciting public disorder." "On whose complaint?" Margaret demanded. "Who has filed charges against me?" "Several concerned citizens have expressed their worry about the dangerous influences you're spreading among the town's children," Hartwell replied smoothly. "It's my duty to maintain order and protect the community from those who would disrupt it." Thomas stepped forward, still holding his hammer. "Sheriff, you'll need to be more specific than that. What exactly has my wife done that constitutes a crime?" Jacob Morrison, the young deputy from the general store, looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Wheeler, maybe you should just step back and let us handle this." "Handle what, exactly?" Thomas's voice was dangerously quiet. "You're making accusations against my wife without presenting any evidence of wrongdoing. In what court of law would such charges even be heard?" The second unfamiliar deputy, a man with a scar running down his left cheek, moved his hand closer to his gun. "Maybe we don't need a court of law for dealing with troublemakers." The crowd that had gathered gasped at the implication. Margaret saw Mrs. Patterson, the woman who had pulled her boys from the lessons, press her hand to her mouth in shock. Even she hadn't expected things to escalate to threats of violence. "You're talking about taking the law into your own hands," Thomas said, his knuckles white around the hammer's handle. "That's not justice, that's mob rule." "Sometimes mob rule is the only thing that works," Scarface replied with a cold smile. Sometimes people need to be reminded of their place in the world, and reminded hard. Sheriff Hartwell shot his deputy a warning look, clearly not wanting such sentiments voiced publicly. But the damage was done. Everyone present now understood that this wasn't really about legal violations or community standards. This was about power and the willingness to use violence to maintain it. "Margaret Wheeler," Hartwell said formally, "you're under arrest. You'll come with us now." "Where are you taking her?" Thomas demanded. "That's not your concern," Hartwell replied. "Your concern should be keeping your mouth shut and your head down if you want to avoid joining her." Margaret looked around at the faces in the crowd, seeing fear and sympathy warring in their expressions. Some of these people supported her, she knew, but they were terrified of what might happen to them if they spoke up. She couldn't blame them. She was terrified too. "I'll come with you," she said quietly, "but I want everyone here to witness that I'm going peacefully and that I've been given no opportunity to answer specific charges in a court of law." "Witness all you want," Hartwell said with a shrug. "Won't change anything." As Margaret stepped forward, Thomas moved to intercept her. "You're not taking my wife anywhere without a proper warrant and specific charges." The scarred deputy's gun cleared its holster so fast that several people in the crowd cried out in alarm. "Step back, Blacksmith, or this conversation ends with you bleeding in the dirt." Margaret grabbed Thomas's arm, feeling the tension in his muscles as he fought every instinct that told him to protect her. "Thomas, please, don't give them an excuse." Her husband's dark eyes burned with frustration and rage, but he allowed her to pull him back. Margaret knew what it cost him to stand down, knew that every fiber of his being rebelled against letting her be taken, but she also knew that if he resisted, these men would use it as justification for far worse than arrest. "I'll find you," Thomas said quietly, his words meant for her alone. "Whatever they're planning, wherever they take you, I'll find you." "I know you will," she whispered back. Sheriff Hartwell produced a set of iron shackles, the metal dark and heavy in the morning light. "Hold out your hands, Mrs. Wheeler." "That's not necessary," Margaret protested. "I've said I'll come peacefully." "The shackles are for your own protection," Hartwell replied with mock concern. "Wouldn't want you to hurt yourself trying to run away." The cold metal closed around Margaret's wrists with a final ominous click. The weight of the iron seemed to settle not just on her hands, but on her heart. She had known this moment might come, but the reality of it was more frightening than any of her imagined scenarios. "Where are you taking her?" Thomas asked again, his voice strained with the effort of remaining calm. "That's still not your concern," Hartwell replied, mounting his horse. "But don't worry, everyone in town will know soon enough." The scarred deputy grabbed Margaret roughly by the arm and began pulling her toward a waiting wagon. She stumbled, the shackles making it difficult to balance, but caught herself before she could fall. The last thing she wanted was to give these men the satisfaction of seeing her helpless. As they lifted her into the back of the wagon, Margaret caught sight of a small face peering around the corner of a building. It was little Sarah, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. Their gazes met for just a moment before the child ducked out of sight, but it was enough. Margaret realized that whatever happened to her would be witnessed by the very children she had been trying to help. The lesson they learned from this moment would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The wagon lurched into motion, and Margaret gripped the wooden sides to keep from being thrown around as they rolled over the rutted street. She could hear Thomas shouting behind them, demanding to know where they were going, but the deputies ignored him. Instead of heading toward the jail, as Margaret had expected, the wagon turned toward the center of town, toward the square where the ancient oak tree stood like a sentinel over Millbrook's daily life. The tree where children played, where couples met, where the community gathered for celebrations and announcements. Margaret's blood turned to ice as she realized what Sheriff Hartwell had meant when he talked about making an example. They weren't taking her to jail. They were taking her to the most public place in town, where every person in Millbrook could see what happened to those who dared to challenge the established order. The wagon stopped beneath the spreading branches of the oak, and Margaret found herself looking up at the massive trunk that had stood here longer than anyone could remember. How many people had sought shelter under these branches? How many children had carved their initials into the bark? How many lovers had pledged their devotion in its shade? Now it was going to be the site of her humiliation, and possibly worse. Sheriff Hartwell dismounted and walked to the back of the wagon, his face grim with purpose. Margaret Wheeler, you've been found guilty of disturbing the peace and corrupting the moral order of this community. Your sentence is to be carried out immediately, in full view of those you've attempted to mislead. Found guilty? Margaret's voice cracked with disbelief. By whom? When? I haven't had a trial, haven't been allowed to defend myself or call witnesses. Sometimes justice moves faster than paperwork, Hartwell replied. Sometimes the community decides what's right and wrong without needing judges and lawyers to complicate things. The crowd was growing larger as word spread through the town. Margaret could see familiar faces in the gathering throng, some hostile, some sympathetic, most simply curious about what was happening in their normally quiet community. She spotted Rebecca Mason near the back, her face pale with shock, and Helen Curtis trying to push through the crowd with tears streaming down her cheeks. But it was the sight of the children that broke Margaret's heart. Despite their parents' attempts to keep them away, several of her former students had managed to slip through the crowd. They stood at the edges of the gathering, their young faces filled with confusion and fear as they watched their teacher, being prepared for whatever punishment Sheriff Hartwell had devised. What exactly is my sentence, Sheriff? Margaret asked, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew. Hartwell gestured toward the oak tree where one of his deputies was uncoiling a length of heavy chain. You're going to stay right here until you've learned your lesson about the proper order of things, chained to this tree like the dangerous animal you've proven yourself to be. The crowd murmured with shock and dismay, even those who had opposed. Margaret's teaching seemed stunned by the severity and public nature of the punishment. This wasn't justice. This was a spectacle designed to humiliate and terrorize anyone who might think of following her example. As the deputies prepared to wrap the chains around both Margaret and the tree, she closed her eyes and tried to find strength in the knowledge that what she had done was right. The children she had taught would remember this moment, would understand that some things were worth fighting for even when the cost was high. What she didn't know was that, at that very moment, Thomas Wheeler was running through the streets of Millbrook, his massive frame moving with surprising speed, as he gathered allies for a confrontation that would determine not just Margaret's fate, but the soul of their entire community. The real battle was about to begin. The iron chains bit into Margaret's shoulders as the deputies secured her to the ancient oak. The metal was cold against her skin, and the weight of it made every breath an effort. But what hurt more than the physical discomfort was the sight of the crowd gathered around the tree, watching her humiliation with a mixture of horror and fascination. Sheriff Hartwell stepped back to admire his handiwork, brushing dust from his hands as if he had just completed a routine task. Let this be a lesson to anyone who thinks they can disrupt the peace of our community, he announced. To the assembled townspeople, Mrs. Wheeler will remain here until she acknowledges her crimes and promises to cease her destructive activities. Margaret lifted her head, meeting the sheriff's gaze with as much dignity as she could muster. And how long might that be, Sheriff? Are you planning to leave me chained to this tree indefinitely? As long as it takes, Hartwell replied. Though I suspect a few hours in the sun will help you see reason. The crowd murmured uneasily. Even those who had opposed Margaret's teaching seemed uncomfortable with the severity of the public punishment. This was Millbrook, not some lawless frontier. Town where vigilante justice was the norm. The sight of a respectable woman chained to a tree like a wild animal disturbed even the most conservative residents. Dr. Franklin Morrison, the town's physician, and Jacob Morrison's uncle pushed through the crowd. "Sheriff Hartwell, this is barbaric. Whatever Mrs. Wheeler's supposed crimes, this kind of punishment has no place in a civilized community." "Dr. Morrison," Hartwell replied smoothly, "I appreciate your concern, but maintaining order sometimes requires strong measures. Mrs. Wheeler has consistently refused to acknowledge the disruption she's caused. Perhaps more direct approach will help her understand the seriousness of her actions." The scarred deputy, whose name Margaret had learned was Pike, spat tobacco juice into the dirt near her feet. "Maybe the good doctor here is another troublemaker who needs a lesson in proper behavior." Dr. Morrison straightened his shoulders, his weathered face flushing with anger. "Are you threatening me, sir? Because I'll remind you that I've been caring for the people of this town since before you were born, and I won't be intimidated by hired thugs." The tension in the square ratcheted higher as Pike's hand drifted toward his gun. But before the confrontation could escalate further, a new voice cut through the air like the ring of steel on steel. "That's enough." Every head turned toward the source of the voice. Thomas Wheeler stood at the edge of the crowd, his massive, a frame silhouetted against the morning sky. But he wasn't alone. Behind him came a group of men that made Sheriff Hartwell's face darken with concern. Samuel Roberts, the mill foreman who employed half the working men in town, stood at Thomas's right shoulder. Next to him was Patrick O'Sullivan, whose Irish ancestry had made him a target of the same prejudice that now threatened Margaret. Behind them came the Curtis brothers, Helen's husband William and his brother James, both of whom worked the lumber. Crews that brought prosperity to Millbrook, but perhaps most significantly Judge Henry Blackwood, Preston Blackwood's older brother and the only man in town with legal authority that rivaled the sheriff's, walked beside Thomas, his face grim with disapproval. "Sheriff Hartwell," Judge Blackwood said, his voice carrying the weight of decades on the bench, "you will explain to me immediately by what authority you have chained this woman to a tree without due process of law." Hartwell's confidence visibly wavered as he faced the judge. Unlike the working men he could intimidate with hired guns, Judge Blackwood represented power that even the sheriff couldn't ignore. "Your Honor, Mrs. Wheeler has been found guilty of disturbing the peace and corrupting the moral order of our community. The sentence is being carried out according to the authority vested in me as sheriff of this county." "Found guilty by whom?" Judge Blackwood demanded. "I see no record of a trial, no jury verdict, no legal proceedings of any kind. What I see is a citizen of this county being subjected to cruel and unusual punishment without the benefit of law." Pike stepped forward, his scarred face twisted with contempt. "Maybe you need to mind your own business, old man. This here's sheriff business, not court business." The words had barely left Pike's mouth when Thomas Wheeler moved. For such a large man, he covered the distance between himself and the deputy with startling speed. Pike's hand was halfway to his gun when Thomas's massive fist connected with his jaw, sending him sprawling into the dirt. "My wife is my business," Thomas said quietly, standing over the fallen deputy. "Anyone who threatens her threatens me." Sheriff Hartwell drew his weapon, pointing it directly at Thomas's chest. "Step back, Wheeler, or I'll put you down right here." But Thomas didn't step back. Instead, he moved closer to his wife, his eyes never leaving Hartwell's face. "You'll have to shoot me in front of every person in this town, Sheriff. And then you'll have to explain to Judge Blackwood why you murdered an unarmed man who was defending his wife." The other deputies moved to support their sheriff, but found themselves facing the group of men who had come with Thomas. Samuel Roberts, held a heavy walking stick. The Curtis brothers had armed themselves with axe handles, and Patrick O'Sullivan carried the kind of shillelagh that had settled many a dispute in his younger days. "This is rebellion," Hartwell snarled. "You're all under arrest for interfering with a lawful execution of justice." "What justice?" Dr. Morrison called out from the crowd. "Where was Mrs. Wheeler's trial? Where was her opportunity to defend herself?" "This isn't justice, it's revenge." Other voices began to join the doctor's protest. Margaret could see the crowd's mood shifting as more people realized the implications of what they were witnessing. If Sheriff Hartwell could chain one person to a tree without trial, what was to stop him from doing the same to anyone who disagreed with him? Judge Blackwood stepped forward, his presence commanding attention. "Sheriff Hartwell, as the senior legal authority in this county, I'm ordering you to release Mrs. Wheeler immediately. She has been denied due process, and this punishment constitutes cruel and unusual treatment prohibited by law." "I don't take orders from you, old man," Hartwell replied, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "I represent the law in this town, not you." "You represent enforcement of the law," Judge Blackwood corrected. "I represent the law itself. And the law says that no citizen can be punished without trial, regardless of the accusations against them." Thomas had been working quietly while the argument continued, his skilled hands examining the chains that bound his wife. As a blacksmith, he understood iron better than anyone in town, and he could see exactly how the restraints had been constructed. "Margaret," he said softly, "can you move your right arm?" She tested the chain, finding a small amount of play in the links. "A little," Thomas nodded, his calloused fingers tracing the metal. "These chains weren't made for this. They're modified horse hobbles, strong enough to hold an animal but not designed for a human being." He looked up at Sheriff Hartwell with cold fury. "You chained my wife with equipment meant for livestock." The revelation sent a wave of disgust through the crowd. Even those who had supported the sheriff's actions were appalled by the degrading nature of the restraints. "Thomas," Margaret whispered, "what are you doing?" "What I should have done the moment they laid hands on you," he replied. From his belt, he drew a heavy iron file, one of the tools of his trade. "These chains have a weakness where they've been modified. The metal is thinner there, stressed from the alteration." Sheriff Hartwell realized what Thomas intended and raised his gun again. "Step away from her, Wheeler, or I'll shoot you where you stand." Thomas looked up at the sheriff, his dark eyes blazing with protective fury. "Then shoot me, but know that every person in this crowd will remember that you murdered a man for trying to free his wife from illegal imprisonment." The silence that followed was broken by an unexpected voice. "Papa, what are they doing to Mrs. Wheeler?" Everyone turned to see little Sarah standing at the edge of the crowd, her young face filled with confusion and fear. Behind her stood her mother Anna, the woman who cleaned Preston Blackwood's house and who had overheard the planning of this public spectacle. The sight of the child seemed to break something in the crowd's mood. These were their neighbors, their teachers, their friends being treated like criminals. The abstract concept of maintaining order suddenly became very personal when viewed through a child's innocent eyes. "Mrs. Wheeler taught me to read," Sarah said in her clear young voice. "She taught me to write my name. Why are they hurting her?" Sheriff Hartwell's face flushed red with embarrassment and anger. "Someone get that child out of here. This is no place for—" "For what?" Thomas interrupted, his file working steadily. "At the weakened link in the chain. For children to see what happens when adults let fear and hatred guide their actions. Maybe it's exactly the place for children to be." Anna stepped forward, placing a protective hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Sarah has every right to see this," she said, her voice carrying across the square. "Mrs. Wheeler risked everything to give my child the same education as any other child in this town. The least we can do is witness what it cost her." More children began to appear at the edges of the crowd as word spread through the town. Emma Curtis slipped past her father to stand near Sarah. William Mason broke away from his mother's protective grip. One by one, Margaret's former students gathered in the square, their young faces serious and watchful. "Look at them," Dr. Morrison called out to the crowd. "Look at those children and tell me that what Mrs. Wheeler was doing was wrong. She was giving them hope, giving them a future. How can that be a crime?" The file in Thomas's hands scraped against iron as he worked, the sound sharp and deliberate in the tense air. Sheriff Hartwell took a step closer, his gun still trained on the blacksmith. "I'm warning you, Wheeler. Step away from those chains." Thomas didn't even look up. "I heard you for the first time." Judge Blackwood moved between the sheriff and Thomas, his elderly frame blocking Hartwell's line of fire. "Sheriff, if you harm this man, you'll answer to me in a court of law. And unlike this travesty you've created today, that will be a real trial with real consequences." The chain gave way with a sharp crack, and Margaret's right arm came free. Thomas immediately began working on the second restraint, his movements quick and efficient. The crowd pressed closer, sensing that the confrontation was reaching its climax. "This ends now," Sheriff Hartwell shouted, pushing past Judge Blackwood and pointing his gun directly at Thomas's head. "Step away from her, or die where you stand." Thomas paused in his work, looking up at the sheriff with calm defiance. "You know what the difference is between us, Hartwell? You use fear to get your way. You threaten and intimidate and hurt people to make them obey. But I use love. I love my wife enough to die for her if necessary." He returned to filing the chain, ignoring the gun pointed at his skull. "So if you're going to shoot me, do it. But know that you'll be killing a man whose only crime was loving someone enough to stand up for what's right." The sheriff's hand trembled slightly as he held the weapon. Around him, the crowd had grown silent, waiting to see if he would actually pull the trigger. Even his own deputies looked uncertain, unwilling to be part of cold-blooded murder. "Unchain." "My wife," Thomas said quietly, his words carrying a strength that no weapon could match. "Unchain her now, and we can all walk away from this without anyone getting hurt." Sheriff Hartwell's face contorted with rage and frustration. Everything he had planned, everything he had worked for, was crumbling before his eyes. The fear and intimidation that had always worked before were powerless against the simple, unwavering love of a man defending his wife. The second chain snapped, and Margaret was free. The broken chains fell to the ground with a metallic clatter that seemed to echo through the entire square. Margaret rubbed her wrists where the iron had chafed her skin, but her eyes never left her husband's face as he stood defiantly before Sheriff Hartwell's drawn weapon. For a long moment, the only sound was the whisper of autumn wind through the oak's branches. Every person in the crowd held their breath, waiting to see if the sheriff would follow through on his threat. Children clutched their parents' hands, men shifted their weight forward ready to act, and women pressed handkerchiefs to their mouths in anticipation of violence. Sheriff Hartwell's gun trembled in his grip, his face a mask of rage and humiliation. Everything he had built, every ounce of fear and respect he had commanded, lay in ruins at his feet. The careful plan he and Preston Blackwood had devised to make an example of Margaret Wheeler had backfired spectacularly, turning her into a martyr and him into a tyrant. "You've made a grave mistake, Wheeler," Hartwell said, his voice barely controlled. "Both of you have. This town won't forget what happened here today." "You're right," Thomas replied, his voice steady despite the weapon pointed at his head. "They won't forget. But they won't remember it the way you think they will." Judge Blackwood stepped closer to the sheriff, his weathered face stern with judicial authority. "Sheriff Hartwell, you have exactly 10 seconds to holster that weapon before I charge you with assault with a deadly weapon. The legal justification for your actions here today ended the moment you pointed a gun at an unarmed man defending his wife." The sheriff's eyes darted around the crowd, searching for support, for someone who would back his play. What he found instead were faces filled with disgust, fear, and disappointment. Even Jacob Morrison, his own deputy, had taken a step back and was shaking his head in obvious disapproval. Carl Brennan, the other local deputy, cleared his throat nervously. "Sheriff, maybe we should think about this. These folks haven't actually broken any real laws. They've broken the most important law of all," Hartwell snarled. "They've challenged authority. They've upset the natural order that keeps this town functioning." Dr. Morrison pushed through the crowd, his medical bag in hand. "The only thing that's been upset here is basic human decency. Sheriff, I'm going to examine Mrs. Wheeler for injuries, and if I find evidence of abuse, I'll be filing formal charges against you with the county prosecutor." "You'll do no such thing," Hartwell snapped, but his authority was bleeding away with every word. The gun in his hand, once a symbol of power, now seemed more like a desperate gesture from a man who had lost control of the situation. Margaret stepped closer to her husband, her presence giving him additional strength. "Sheriff," she said quietly, "look around you. Look at these people. Look at the children. Is this really the legacy you want to leave? Is this how you want to be remembered?" "I'll be remembered as the man who kept this town from falling into chaos," Hartwell replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "No," said a new voice from the crowd. "You'll be remembered as the man who chained an innocent woman to a tree for teaching children to read." The speaker was Preston Blackwood himself, pushing through the assembled townspeople with an expression of barely contained fury. Margaret felt a chill of fear as she saw him approach. This was the man who had orchestrated the entire confrontation, the one with the real power to destroy lives in Millbrook. But as Blackwood drew closer, Margaret realized that his anger wasn't directed at her or Thomas. His cold gaze was fixed squarely on Sheriff Hartwell. "What in hell do you think you're doing, Hartwell?" Blackwood demanded. "This was supposed to be a quiet resolution to a minor problem, not a public spectacle that makes us look like barbarians." Sheriff Hartwell's confusion was evident. "Mr. Blackwood, we discussed this. You said an example needed to be made. Said the situation needed to be handled discreetly," Blackwood replied through gritted teeth. "I didn't say anything about chaining women to trees in front of the entire town, including children. Do you have any idea what this looks like to the outside world?" The crowd murmured with interest at this revelation. Here was proof that the punishment had been planned in advance, that Sheriff Hartwell hadn't been acting alone in his vendetta against Margaret. Judge Blackwood, despite sharing a surname with the landowner, had no love for his younger brother's business practices. "Preston, are you admitting that you conspired with the sheriff to deny Mrs. Wheeler due process of law?" Preston Blackwood's face darkened as he realized he had said too much in public. "I'm admitting nothing. I'm simply trying to restore order to a situation that has gotten completely out of hand." "The only thing out of hand here," Thomas said, still facing down the sheriff's gun, "is the abuse of power by men who think they own this town and everyone in it." Samuel Roberts, the mill foreman, stepped forward. "Mr. Blackwood, you employ half the men in this town, including me, but that doesn't give you the right to decide who can learn and who can't. My boy Johnny has been attending Mrs. Wheeler's lessons, and he's learned more in 2 months than he did in 2 years with that drunk Ashford. Your boy Johnny needs to learn his trade, not waste time with books and fancy ideas," Blackwood replied coldly. "That's for me to decide, not you," Roberts shot back. "And I say my son deserves every chance to better himself than any other child gets." Other voices began to join the conversation, parents stepping forward to defend both Margaret's teaching and their children's right to education. What had started as Sheriff Hartwell's attempt to intimidate one woman had grown into a community-wide debate about power, privilege, and the rights of ordinary people. "Enough!" Sheriff Hartwell shouted, swinging his gun to cover the growing crowd. "All of you, back away! This ends now!" But instead of backing away, the townspeople pressed closer. The children who had been Margaret's students moved to the front. Of the group, their young faces determined and unafraid. Little Sarah reached out and took Margaret's hand, her small fingers warm and comforting. "Mrs. Wheeler," Sarah said in her clear young voice, "will you keep teaching us, even after this?" Margaret looked down at the child, then up at the crowd of faces surrounding her. She saw hope and determination, fear and courage, all mixed together in the complex tapestry of human emotion. These people had risked their jobs, their safety, their standing in the community to defend her. How could she do anything but continue? "The fight. Yes, Sarah," she said firmly. "I'll keep teaching anyone who wants to learn for as long as I'm able." Sheriff Hartwell's face contorted with rage. "I won't allow it. I'll arrest every one of you if necessary." "On what charges?" Judge Blackwood demanded. "Teaching? Learning? Being part of a community that actually cares about its children's futures?" Dr. Morrison had finished his examination of Margaret's wrists and ankles, noting the chafing and bruising left by the chains. "Sheriff Hartwell, as the senior medical authority in this county, I'm filing formal charges against you for assault and false imprisonment. Mrs. Wheeler has been injured by your illegal actions." "Those aren't real injuries," Pike said, struggling to his feet after Thomas's devastating punch. His jaw was swollen and his words slurred, but his hand was moving toward his gun. "Maybe she needs some real injuries to teach her a lesson." The threat was too much for Thomas. He moved with the fluid precision of a man who had spent his life working with dangerous tools and materials. Before Pike could clear his holster, Thomas had closed the distance between them and delivered another crushing blow, this one to the deputy's solar plexus. Pike collapsed, gasping for air. "Touch my wife again," Thomas said quietly, "and I'll kill you." The simple statement, delivered without heat or bravado, sent a chill through everyone present. This wasn't an angry threat or an empty boast. It was a calm statement of fact from a man who had reached the absolute limit of his patience. Sheriff Hartwell realized that the situation had completely spiraled beyond his control. His hired deputies were down, his authority was being openly challenged, and the entire town was turning against him. The gun in his hand felt heavy and useless. He could shoot one person, maybe two, but then what? The crowd would tear him apart. "This isn't over," he said, slowly holstering his weapon. "You people think you've won something here today, but you're wrong. There are consequences for defying authority, and those consequences will come whether you expect them or not." "The only authority being defied here," Judge Blackwood said firmly, "is your own illegal abuse of power. Sheriff, consider yourself relieved of duty pending a formal investigation into your conduct." Hartwell's face went white with shock. "You can't do that. I was elected by the people of this county, and you can be removed by proper legal process when you violate your oath of office," the judge replied, "which you have done repeatedly and publicly today." Preston Blackwood stepped closer to his brother, his voice low and dangerous. "Henry, you're making a mistake. The sheriff was acting to maintain order in our community. If you remove him, you'll create chaos." "The chaos already exists, Preston," Judge Blackwood replied sadly. "It was created the moment we decided that some of our citizens matter less than others. Mrs. Wheeler didn't disrupt our community. She revealed what our community had already become." Margaret felt tears stinging her eyes as she listened to the judge's words. This man, who could have easily sided with wealth and power, had chosen instead to stand with justice and human dignity. It gave her hope that change was possible, even in a place as set in its ways as Millbrook. Thomas put his arm around his wife's shoulders, pulling her close. "We should go home," he said quietly. "You need to rest, and we need to figure out what comes next." But before they could leave, Rebecca Mason pushed through the crowd, tears streaming down her face. "Mrs. Wheeler, I'm so sorry. We should have done more to protect you. We should have stood up sooner. "You stood up when it mattered most," Margaret replied, embracing the other woman. "That's what courage really is, not the absence of fear, but doing what's right despite the fear." One by one, other parents came forward to thank Margaret and to promise their continued support for her educational efforts. The children gathered around her like chicks around a mother hen, their faces bright with the knowledge that their teacher would not be driven away by threats and intimidation. Sheriff Hartwell watched this display of community solidarity with growing bitterness. His carefully laid plans had not only failed, but had actually strengthened the very movement he had tried to destroy. Margaret Wheeler was no longer just a teacher conducting informal lessons. She had become a symbol of resistance against injustice. "Come on," he said to his remaining deputies. "We're leaving." As they mounted their horses and rode away from the square, the crowd began to disperse. But the conversations that started that day would continue in homes and businesses throughout Millbrook, planting seeds of change that would grow for generations to come. Margaret and Thomas walked home together, their steps slow and careful as the adrenaline of the confrontation began to fade. The autumn air felt clean and cool against their faces, and the familiar sounds of their neighborhood seemed precious after the trauma of the morning. "What happens now?" Margaret asked, as they reached their front door. Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "Now we keep doing what we believe is right," he said finally. "We keep teaching, keep learning, keep fighting for the idea that all people deserve dignity and opportunity. Even if it's dangerous?" Thomas turned to face his wife, his dark eyes, serious but unafraid. "Especially if it's dangerous, because if we don't fight for what's right, who will?" Margaret smiled, the first genuine smile she had managed since the ordeal began. She had married a good man, a strong man, a man who understood that some principles were worth any sacrifice. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Inside their house, Margaret sat down to write in her journal, recording every detail of the day's events. Future generations would need to know what had happened here, would need to understand the price that had been paid for the simple idea that education was a right, not a privilege. As she wrote, Thomas worked at his forge, the rhythmic hammering of metal on metal serving as a reminder that life would go on. The tools he made would serve the community, just as his wife's teaching served the children. Both were acts of creation. Both were ways of making the world a little better than they had found it. The battle for the soul of Millbrook had been won, but the war for justice and equality would continue. And Margaret Wheeler, the schoolteacher who had been chained to a tree for teaching children to read, would be remembered as the woman who helped a community find its conscience. The oak tree stood silent in the empty square, its branches reaching toward the sky like arms raised in victory. Tomorrow, children would play in its shade again, but they would also remember what had happened beneath its sheltering limbs. They would remember the day their teacher was chained like an animal, and the day their community chose love over fear. It was a lesson that would last a lifetime. 6 months after the confrontation at the oak tree, Millbrook had transformed into a town that barely resembled its former self. The changes weren't immediately visible to a casual observer. The same buildings lined the same streets, the same businesses operated from the same locations, but beneath the surface, everything had shifted. Margaret Wheeler stood in the doorway of what had once been Cornelius Ashford's failing school, now converted into the Millbrook Community Learning Center. The bitter old schoolmaster had left town 3 weeks after the incident at the Oak, claiming he could no longer work in a place where proper educational standards weren't respected. Margaret had purchased the building with money donated by families throughout the county who had heard about her story. The morning sun streamed through the large windows, illuminating rows of desks where children of all ages and backgrounds worked side by side. Sarah sat next to Emma Curtis. Both girls bent over their slates as they practiced their multiplication tables. William Mason helped a younger boy sound out words from a reader, his patience and gentle manner reflecting the teaching style he had learned from Margaret herself. But perhaps most remarkable was the presence of adults scattered throughout the classroom. Rebecca Mason sat in the back corner, learning to write her own name for the first time at age 34. Samuel Roberts attended evening classes twice a week, determined to read the newspapers and contracts that affected his work at the mill. Even Dr. Morrison had begun studying Latin with Margaret, claiming it would help him better understand medical texts. "Mrs. Wheeler," called out Emma Curtis, raising her hand excitedly, "I finished the story you assigned. Can I read it to the in class?" Margaret smiled, nodding her approval. Emma stood and walked to the front of the room, her voice clear and confident as she began to read the short story she had written about a brave mouse who saved her village from a terrible flood. The other children listened intently, some taking notes, others simply enjoying the tale. This was what Margaret had dreamed of during those dark moments chained to the oak tree, a place where learning was celebrated, where curiosity was encouraged, where every person was valued, regardless of their background or circumstances. The sound of approaching horses drew Margaret's attention to the window. A familiar figure dismounted from a fine bay gelding and tied it to the hitching post outside the school. Judge Henry Blackwood had become a regular visitor to the learning center, often bringing books from his personal library or news from the county seat. "Good morning, Your Honor," Margaret said as the judge entered the classroom. "What brings you here today?" Judge Blackwood's weathered face was grave as he removed his hat. "I'm afraid I have news that's both good and troubling, Mrs. Wheeler." "May we speak privately?" Margaret nodded, asking one of her older students to watch the class while she stepped outside with the judge. They walked to a bench beneath the oak tree, the same tree where Margaret had been chained 6 months earlier. The town had decided to place a small bronze plaque at its base, reading simply, "In memory of those who fought for justice and equality. October 1847. "What news do you have, Judge?" Margaret asked, settling onto the bench. "The good news first," Blackwood replied, reaching into his coat pocket. "I've received official confirmation from the state capital. Your learning center has been granted full recognition as an educational institution. You're now legally authorized to issue certificates of completion that will be accepted by any school or employer in the state." Margaret felt a surge of joy and pride. The recognition meant that her students' education would be valued beyond the borders of Millbrook, that they could take their knowledge and skills anywhere in the country. "And the troubling news?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew. Judge Blackwood's expression darkened. "Clayton Hartwell has been released from prison. The charges against him were reduced due to political pressure from certain influential parties. He served only 4 months of his 2-year sentence." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Sheriff Hartwell had been convicted of assault, false imprisonment, and abuse of authority, but she had known that men like him rarely stayed down for long. There were always people willing to help them return to power, especially when that power served their own interests. "Where is he now?" she asked. "That's what makes this particularly concerning," the judge replied. "He's returned to Millbrook. My sources tell me he's been meeting with my brother Preston and several other landowners from neighboring counties. They're planning something, Mrs. Wheeler, something designed to undermine everything you've accomplished here." Margaret looked around the town square, watching the normal rhythms of daily life continue around them. Children played near the fountain, while their mothers chatted and shopped. Men discussed business outside the bank. Everything seemed peaceful and ordinary, but she knew that peace could be shattered as easily as it had been 6 months ago. "What kind of plan?" she asked. "Economic warfare," Judge Blackwood said grimly. "They can't use legal means to shut down your school. Not anymore, not with the state recognition. But they can make life very difficult for the families who support you. Preston has been buying up mortgages and business loans throughout the county. He's in a position to foreclose on anyone who crosses him." The implications were staggering. If Preston Blackwood could threaten the livelihoods of her students' families, he could effectively force them to withdraw from the learning center without ever setting foot on the property. "There's more," the judge continued. "Hartwell has been appointed as a special deputy by the sheriff of Clearwater County. Officially, it's a temporary position to help with law enforcement in rural areas. Unofficially, it gives him a badge and a gun again." "Judge," she said quietly, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Are you advising me to close the school, to run before things get worse?" Henry Blackwood was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the bronze plaque at the base of the oak tree. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a lifetime spent trying to balance justice with practicality. "Mrs. Wheeler, I've been a judge for 37 years. I've seen good people destroyed by powerful interests, and I've seen justice perverted by men who believe might makes right. If I were thinking only of your safety and that of your family, I would advise you to leave Millbrook tonight and never look back." Margaret felt her heart sink, but the judge wasn't finished. "However," he continued, "I've also seen what happens when good people refuse to be intimidated. I've watched communities transform when someone has the courage to stand up for what's right. What you've built here isn't just a school, Mrs. Wheeler. It's proof that change is possible, that ordinary people can overcome extraordinary obstacles when they work together." He turned to face her directly, his eyes serious but kind. "The question isn't whether you should continue. The question is whether we can find a way to protect what you've built while you continue to build it." "We?" Margaret asked. Judge Blackwood smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him that day. "Did you think you were alone in this fight, Mrs. Wheeler? You've inspired people throughout this county and beyond. Word of what happened here has spread to the state capital, to other towns facing similar struggles. You have allies you don't even know about." As if summoned by his words, a group of riders appeared at the far end of the main street. Margaret counted 6 men, all wearing the distinctive badges of federal marshals. They rode with the easy confidence of professional lawmen, their presence immediately noticeable to everyone in the square. The lead marshal, a tall man with silver hair and steady grey eyes, dismounted in front of the courthouse and began asking questions of the townspeople. Margaret couldn't hear the conversation, but she could see people pointing in the direction of the learning center. "Federal marshals," Judge Blackwood observed. "I wonder what brings them to our little town." They didn't have to wonder for long. The silver-haired marshal approached their bench, his expression serious but not unfriendly. "Judge Blackwood, I'm Marshal James Crawford from the Federal District Office. I'm looking for Mrs. Margaret Wheeler." Margaret stood, smoothing her skirts. Nervously, "I'm Margaret Wheeler, Marshal. What can I do for you?" Marshal Crawford touched the brim of his hat respectfully. "Ma'am, I'm here on orders from the Federal District Attorney. We've received reports of ongoing civil rights violations in this county, threats, intimidation, and attempts to prevent citizens from exercising their constitutional rights." Margaret exchanged glances with Judge Blackwood. This was unexpected, and potentially very significant. "Marshal," she said carefully, "I'm not sure I understand. What constitutional rights are you referring to?" "The right to education, ma'am," Crawford replied. "The right to assembly, the right to equal treatment under the law. We've received depositions from several citizens describing a pattern of harassment and abuse by local authorities, all centered around attempts to prevent the establishment of your educational institution." Judge Blackwood leaned forward with interest. "Marshal Crawford, might I ask who filed these complaints?" "Multiple sources, Your Honor," Crawford replied, "but I can tell you that they came from as far away as the state capital." It seems Mrs. Wheeler's story has attracted attention from some very influential people, people who believe that what happened here represents a larger problem that needs federal intervention. Margaret felt a mixture of hope and trepidation. Federal intervention could provide the protection she needed to continue her work, but it could also escalate the conflict to dangerous new levels. "What exactly are you planning to do, Marshal?" she asked. "For now, we're gathering evidence," Crawford replied, "interviewing witnesses, documenting threats, building a case. But I can tell you that we've already obtained federal warrants for the arrest of Clayton Hartwell and several of his associates on charges of conspiracy to violate civil rights." The news hit Margaret like a physical blow. She had expected more harassment, more attempts at intimidation, but she hadn't anticipated that federal authorities would take such a direct interest in her situation. "Marshal," Judge Blackwood said, quietly, "you should know that tensions in this area are already running high. Federal intervention, while legally justified, could provoke a violent response from certain elements in the community." Crawford nodded grimly. "We're aware of that possibility, Your Honor. That's why we've brought additional men and why we're coordinating with state authorities. But we can't allow fear of violence to prevent us from enforcing the law." As they spoke, Margaret noticed movement in her peripheral vision. Thomas was approaching from the direction of his blacksmith shop, his long strides eating up the distance quickly. Behind him came Samuel Roberts and several other men who had supported Margaret during the original confrontation. "Margaret," Thomas called out as he reached the group, "there's something you need to know. Preston Blackwood and about 20 riders just passed through town, heading toward the old Hartwell place. They were armed, and they looked like they meant business." Marshal Crawford's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon. "How long ago?" "About 10 minutes, Thomas replied. "My apprentice saw them from the shop and came to tell me immediately." The marshal turned to his men, who had been waiting nearby. "Johnson, take 3 men and establish a perimeter around the school. Nobody gets in or out without my permission. Davis, ride back to the county seat and request immediate backup. At least a dozen more marshals and some state militia if you can get them." "Marshal," Margaret said urgently, "my students are still in the classroom. If there's going to be trouble, we'll protect them, ma'am," Crawford assured her. "But right now, I need you to gather everyone important to this situation in one secure location. If Hartwell and Blackwood are planning something, we need to be ready for it." Judge Blackwood stood, his face grim with determination. "Marshal, I suggest we use the courthouse. It's the most defensible building in town, and it has both legal and symbolic significance." As they began moving toward the courthouse, Margaret felt the familiar mixture of fear and resolve that had sustained her through previous challenges. The confrontation she had hoped was over was apparently just beginning, but this time she wouldn't face it alone. This time, she had the law on her side. The children from the learning center were quickly evacuated to their homes or brought to the courthouse under federal protection. Parents arrived in various states of panic and determination, some trying to take their children away from the danger, others insisting on staying to support Margaret and the cause she represented. Rebecca Mason arrived with her son William, her face pale but determined. "Mrs. Wheeler, we're not abandoning you now, not after everything we've been through together." Helen Curtis nodded in agreement. "My Emma has learned to read because of you. She has a future now that she wouldn't have had otherwise. We're staying." One by one, the families who had supported Margaret's educational efforts gathered in the courthouse, turning it into an impromptu fortress. Thomas worked with the federal marshals to barricade the windows, while Dr. Morrison set up a medical station in case of injuries. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, lookouts posted on the courthouse roof reported movement on the hills surrounding Millbrook. Riders were taking positions, surrounding the town in what appeared to be a carefully coordinated effort Margaret stood at a second-floor window, watching the shadows lengthen across the town square. The oak tree stood silhouetted against the evening sky, its branches reaching upward like arms raised in defiance. Tomorrow would bring another battle in the war for justice and equality, but tonight she was surrounded by people who believed in the same principles she did, whatever came. Next they would face it together, and that, Margaret realized, made all the difference in the world. Dawn broke over Millbrook with an eerie stillness that made everyone inside the courthouse hold their breath. The federal marshals had maintained their watch throughout the night, reporting periodic movement in the hills, but no direct approach toward the town. Now, as pale morning light filtered through the barricaded windows, the waiting game was about to end. Marshal Crawford stood at the main window of Judge Blackwood's chambers, a spyglass pressed to his eye as he studied the surrounding terrain. "They're moving," he announced quietly. "At least 30 riders coming down the north slope, maybe more behind the tree line." Margaret felt Thomas's hand find hers as they stood together near the back of the room. Around them, the families who had chosen to stay clustered in small groups, parents holding their children close while trying to maintain an air of calm normalcy. The younger children didn't fully understand the danger, but they sensed the tension in every adult face. "Mrs. Wheeler," Marshal Crawford said, turning from the window, "I need you to understand something. What's about to happen here goes far beyond your school or even this town. The federal government has been watching situations like this develop across the country. How we handle this confrontation will send a message about whether local power structures can override federal law." Margaret nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders once again. "What do you need me to do, Marshal?" "I need you to trust that we're prepared for this," Crawford replied. "But I also need you to be ready to make some difficult decisions if negotiations break down." Before Margaret could ask what he meant, a shout from one of the lookouts interrupted the conversation. "Riders approaching under a white flag." Crawford grabbed his spyglass again, studying the approaching group. 3 men, Preston Blackwood in the lead, Clayton Hartwell beside him, and someone I don't recognize. "They're coming to parley." Judge Blackwood stepped forward, his face grim. "Marshal, if you're going to negotiate with my brother, you should know that he's not a man who compromises easily. He sees this entire situation as a threat to everything he's built his life around." "What exactly has he built his life around?" Crawford asked. "Control," Thomas said quietly from across the room. "Preston Blackwood has spent 40 years making sure that every important decision in this county goes through him. Workers, businesses, even local politicians, they all depend on his approval to survive. Margaret's school represents something he can't control, and that terrifies him." The sound of horses stopping outside the courthouse drew everyone's attention. Through the barricaded windows, they could see Preston Blackwood dismounting from his horse with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to command. Clayton Hartwell remained mounted, his hand resting conspicuously on his gun despite the white flag they carried. "I'll meet with them on the courthouse steps," Marshal Crawford announced. "Judge, I'd like you with me as the senior legal authority. Mrs. Wheeler, you should come too. This is fundamentally about your right to operate that school." Margaret felt her pulse quicken, but she nodded her agreement. Thomas started to object, but she placed a gentle hand on his arm. "I need to face this," she said quietly. "I need to hear what they have to say." The 3 of them made their way downstairs and out onto the courthouse steps, where Preston Blackwood waited with the confidence of a man who had never doubted his own authority. Up close, Margaret could see the family resemblance between the brothers, but where Judge Blackwood's face showed the weathering of years spent weighing difficult decisions, Preston's showed the hardness of a man accustomed to having his way. "Henry," Preston said to his brother, his voice carrying a mixture of disappointment and condescension, "I had hoped you would see reason before things reached this point." "The only thing I see," Judge Blackwood replied evenly, "is a man who thinks he's above the law, attempting to intimidate federal officers and terrorize innocent citizens." Preston's cold gaze shifted to Margaret. "Mrs. Wheeler, you've caused quite a stir for such a small-town schoolteacher. My brother seems to think you're some kind of champion of justice, but I see something different. I see a woman who's forgotten her place and dragged an entire community into chaos because of her stubborn pride." "My place," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins, "is wherever I choose to stand up for what's right. If that threatens your vision of order, then perhaps your vision needs to change." Clayton Hartwell spat tobacco juice into the dirt. His scarred face twisted with contempt. "Still running your mouth, I see. 6 months in prison gave me plenty of time to think about what I should have done to you the first time." Marshal Crawford stepped between Hartwell and Margaret, his hand moving to his weapon. "That sounds very much like a threat, Mr. Hartwell. I'd be careful about making threats in front of a federal officer." "It's not a threat," Hartwell replied, with a cold smile. "It's a promise. This town was peaceful before she started filling people's heads with dangerous ideas. One way or another, that peace is going to be restored." Preston Blackwood raised a hand to silence his associate. "Marshal Crawford, I assume you're here because someone has filed complaints about local law enforcement. I'm prepared to offer a reasonable solution that should satisfy everyone involved." "I'm listening," Crawford said, though his tone suggested he wasn't optimistic. "Mrs. Wheeler can keep her school," Preston continued, "provided she agrees to certain modifications to her curriculum and student body. Nothing too dramatic, simply ensuring that the education provided aligns with community standards and serves appropriate populations." Margaret felt anger flare in her chest. "Appropriate populations? You mean excluding children based on the color of their skin or their parents' social status?" "I mean maintaining the natural order that has allowed this community to prosper for generations," Preston replied smoothly. "Surely you can see the wisdom in that approach." "What I see," Judge Blackwood interjected, "is a proposal that violates both state and federal law. Mrs. Wheeler's school has been granted official recognition precisely because it does not discriminate based on race or social class." Preston's facade of reasonableness began to crack. "Henry, you're allowing yourself to be influenced by outside agitators who don't understand how things work in the real world. This woman has turned our town into a battleground, and for what? So that field hands and domestics can learn to read? So that children can be taught to think they're equal to their betters?" "They are equal to their betters," Margaret said quietly. "That's the point you keep missing, Mr. Blackwood. There are no betters and inferiors. There are just human beings with different opportunities." The words seemed to strike Preston like a physical blow. His face darkened with rage, and for a moment Margaret thought he might actually strike her. Instead, he turned to Marshal Crawford with barely controlled fury. "Marshal, I'm going to make this very simple for you. Mrs. Wheeler and her supporters have 48 hours to leave this county voluntarily. If they choose not to leave, they'll be removed by other means." Crawford's response was immediate and uncompromising. "Mr. Blackwood, you just made terrorist threats against United States citizens in the presence of a federal officer. You're under arrest." The marshal's hand moved toward his weapon, but Preston was already backing away toward his horse. "I don't think so, Marshal. You're outnumbered and surrounded. Your federal authority means nothing out here." As if summoned by his words, riders began emerging from concealment around the courthouse. Margaret counted at least 50 men, all armed, all positioned to control every exit from the building. The federal marshals were indeed outnumbered, but they showed no signs of backing down. "Mr. Blackwood," Crawford called out as Preston mounted his horse, "you're making this much worse for yourself. Surrender now, and we can resolve this through proper legal channels." Preston's laugh was harsh and humorless. "Legal channels? Marshal, you're a long way from Washington, and there are no legal channels out here except the ones I create. You have 1 hour to consider my offer. After that, we stop talking and start acting." The 3 men rode away, leaving the federal marshals and the townspeople to contemplate an impossible situation. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and facing men who had clearly decided that violence was preferable to accepting change. Back inside the courthouse, Marshal Crawford gathered his men for a strategic discussion. Margaret listened as they debated their options, none of which seemed particularly promising. They could try to fight their way out, but that would likely result in casualties among the civilians they were trying to protect. They could surrender and hope for mercy, but Preston Blackwood had shown no inclination toward mercy, or they could wait for backup that might not arrive in time. "There is another option," Judge Blackwood said quietly. "Something none of you are considering because you're thinking like lawmen instead of politicians." Crawford looked up with interest. "What do you mean?" "Preston's strength comes from his ability to control the economic life of this county," the judge explained. "But that control depends on cooperation from people who might not be as committed to his cause as he believes." Thomas stepped forward, understanding dawning on his face. "You're talking about the workers, the men who actually run the mills and farms and businesses that make Preston Blackwood rich." "Exactly," Judge Blackwood replied. "My brother has always assumed that economic dependence equals loyalty. But Margaret's school has been teaching those workers' children, giving them hope for something better. That changes the equation." Margaret felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest. "You think we can turn his own workers against him?" "I think," the judge said with a slight smile, "that we might be able to remind them that they have power too, if they choose to use it." Samuel Roberts, who had been listening intently, suddenly straightened with understanding. "The mill. If the workers at Preston's lumber mill refuse to work, if they support Mrs. Wheeler instead of him, he loses his primary source of income. More than that," added Patrick O'Sullivan, "if word spreads to the other mills and farms in the county, if workers everywhere realize they don't have to accept his version of how things should be." Crawford was beginning to see the possibilities. "You're talking about organizing a labor action, getting the workers to stand up to their employer." "I'm talking about getting them to stand up for their children," Margaret corrected. "Those workers send their children to my school because they want something better for them. If they understand that supporting me means supporting their children's futures, they might be willing to take risks." Dr. Morrison, who had been tending to a child with a fever, looked up from his patient. "It's dangerous. Preston Blackwood has the power to destroy any worker who opposes him. These men have families to feed." "They also have consciences," Rebecca Mason said firmly, "and they have children who deserve better than a world where some people matter less than others." Over the next hour, as Preston Blackwood's deadline approached, a plan began to take shape. Thomas would slip out of the courthouse using his knowledge of the building's old maintenance tunnels, then make his way to the lumber mill to speak with the workers. Samuel Roberts would coordinate with other foremen throughout the county, using a network of friendships and professional relationships that had developed over decades. But the key to the plan was Margaret herself. She would have to address the workers directly, not as a teacher or an outsider, but as a member of their community who understood what they were risking and why it mattered. "It's dangerous," Thomas said, as they prepared to put the plan into action. "If Preston's men catch you outside the courthouse, then they catch me," Margaret replied simply. "But if we don't try this, if we just wait here for them to overrun us, then everything we've fought for dies anyway." As Thomas disappeared into the courthouse basement to find the old tunnel system, Margaret prepared herself for what might be the most important speech of her life. Outside, Preston Blackwood's men waited with their guns and their certainty that power came from the barrel of a weapon. But Margaret Wheeler had learned something different. She had learned that the most powerful force in the world was people, who refused to accept injustice, who stood together despite their fears, who chose hope over despair. In 30 minutes, she would find out if that lesson was true. The lumber mill fell silent as Margaret Wheeler emerged from the shadows beside the main warehouse, her appearance drawing startled gasps from the workers who had gathered for their midday break. Word had spread quickly through the mill about the standoff at the courthouse, but seeing the woman at the center of the conflict standing before them made everything suddenly real. Thomas had reached the mill 20 minutes earlier, using the old maintenance tunnels that connected several buildings in downtown Millbrook. His message had been simple. Margaret Wheeler needed to speak to the workers, and their response could determine not just her fate, but the future of their children's education. Now, as Margaret stepped into the circle of rough-hewn men who spent their days cutting and shaping the timber that built houses across 3 counties, she felt the weight of everything that had led to this moment. These were not politicians or lawyers or wealthy landowners. These were the men whose labor created the prosperity that others claimed credit for. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the mill yard, "I know you're taking a risk just by listening to me. I know that Preston Blackwood signs your paychecks and that defying him could cost you your jobs. But I'm here because there's something more important at stake than any of our individual security." Samuel Roberts stepped forward from the crowd. As mill foreman, his presence gave Margaret's words additional weight with the other workers. "Mrs. Wheeler, we've heard about what's happening at the courthouse. Federal marshals, armed riders, threats of violence. Some of the men are wondering why we should get involved in something that could get us all killed." Margaret nodded, understanding their fear. "Mr. Roberts, I'm not asking anyone to risk their lives for me. I'm asking you to consider what kind of world you want to leave for your children." She gestured toward a group of younger workers, men, barely out of their teens, who had started at the mill because it was the only work available to them. "How many of you have children attending my school? How many of you have seen your sons and daughters learn to read, learn to write, learn to dream of something beyond a life of manual labor?" Hands began to rise throughout the crowd. Margaret counted at least 30 men whose children had been her students, and she knew there were others who simply hadn't raised their hands yet. "Mr. Brennan," she said, addressing one of the mill workers directly, "your daughter Sarah can now read better than most adults in this town. She's been helping her younger brother with his letters, teaching him what she learned in my classroom. Do you want her to have the same opportunities as Preston Blackwood's grandchildren? Or should she accept that her place in life was decided the day she was born?" William Brennan, a weathered man with calloused hands and intelligent eyes, stepped closer. "Mrs. Wheeler, you're asking us to bite the hand that feeds us. Preston Blackwood owns this mill, owns most of the businesses in town. If we stand against him, where will we work? How will we feed our families?" "That's exactly the question Preston Blackwood wants you to ask," Margaret replied. "He wants you to believe that you have no choice, that you're completely dependent on his goodwill for your survival. But look around you, Mr. Brennan. Look at this mill, at the work you do every day. Who actually creates the value here? Who cuts the timber, operates the machinery, loads the wagons?" The workers exchanged glances, beginning to understand where Margaret was leading them. "Preston Blackwood owns the land and the equipment," she continued, "but this mill doesn't run without you. None of his businesses run without workers like you. He's not doing you a favor by giving you jobs. You're creating his wealth with your labor." Thomas had been standing quietly at the edge of the crowd, but now he spoke up. "Margaret's right. I've worked as a blacksmith in this town for 15 years. Every tool I've made, every horseshoe I've shaped, every piece of equipment I've repaired has helped someone else make money. But I've never thought of myself as powerless because I own my skills, my knowledge, my ability to work. That's different. called out another worker. "You own your own shop. We're just employees." "Are you?" Margaret asked. "Or are you skilled craftsmen who happen to work for someone else? What would happen if every worker in this mill decided to stop working tomorrow? What would happen if the workers at every mill, every farm, every business in this county decided they deserved better treatment?" The idea was revolutionary, and Margaret could see it taking hold in the minds of men who had never considered their collective power. For generations, they had thought of themselves as individuals competing for scarce jobs, not as a group with shared interests and common strength. Samuel Roberts rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Mrs. Wheeler, you're talking about more than just supporting your school. You're talking about changing the entire relationship between workers and employers in this county. I'm talking about giving your children a chance to live in a world where their worth isn't determined by their parents' social status," Margaret replied. "I'm talking about creating a community where education and opportunity are available to everyone, not just those born into wealth." Patrick O'Sullivan stepped forward, his Irish accent thick with emotion. "My family came to this country with nothing but the clothes on our backs. We were told we were inferior, that we should be grateful for whatever scraps the wealthy saw fit to give us. But my boy Johnny has been attending Mrs. Wheeler's school, and he reads better than some college graduates I've met. He's going to have choices I never had. That's what this is really about," Margaret said, building on Patrick's words. "Choice. The choice to determine your own future and your children's futures. Preston Blackwood wants to take that choice away, wants to decide who gets educated and who doesn't, who rises and who stays down." Dr. Morrison appeared at the edge of the mill yard, having made his way from the courthouse through a network of back alleys and friendly houses. His presence surprised the workers, but his words carried additional weight because of his respected imposition in the community. "Gentlemen," he said, slightly out of breath from his journey, "I've just come from the courthouse. Preston Blackwood and his armed men are preparing to attack federal marshals and the families who have taken refuge there. This isn't just about Mrs. Wheeler's school anymore. It's about whether we live under the rule of law or under the rule of whoever has the most guns." The gravity of the situation settled over the workers like a heavy blanket. This wasn't an abstract philosophical discussion. People they knew and cared about were in immediate danger. "What exactly are you asking us to do?" William Brennan asked. Margaret took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would determine everything. "I'm asking you to leave your jobs right now. I'm asking you to march to the courthouse and stand with the federal marshals. I'm asking you to show Preston Blackwood that his power depends on your cooperation, and that cooperation can be withdrawn." "And if he fires us all?" another worker called out. Thomas answered before Margaret could respond. "Then you start your own mill. You form a cooperative and run it yourselves. You already know how to do the work. Why should you make Preston Blackwood rich doing it?" The idea sent a murmur of excitement through the crowd. The concept of worker-owned businesses was not entirely unknown, but it had never been seriously considered in Millbrook. "The federal government has programs to support such cooperatives," Dr. Morrison added. Marshall Crawford mentioned that there are funds available to help communities establish worker-owned enterprises. Mrs. Wheeler's school would be perfectly positioned to provide the education and training needed to make such ventures successful. Margaret felt hope building in her chest as she saw the workers beginning to embrace the possibilities being presented to them. But she also knew that the decision had to be theirs, made freely and with full understanding of the risks involved. "Gentlemen," she said, "I won't lie to you about the dangers. If you stand with me today, Preston Blackwood will try to destroy you. He has money, influence, and men with guns, but he doesn't have what we have." "What do we have?" Samuel Roberts asked. "We have each other," Margaret replied simply. "We have the knowledge that what we're fighting for is right. We have children who are counting on us to give them a better future. And we have the truth that no amount of money or violence can change. That all people deserve dignity, opportunity, and respect. The workers stood in silence for a long moment, weighing Margaret's words against their fears and hopes. Then, without any formal vote or discussion, they began to move. Tools were set aside, machinery was shut down, and men who had never considered themselves political began walking toward the courthouse where their neighbors waited under siege. William Brennan fell into step beside Margaret as they left the mill yard. "Mrs. Wheeler, I want you to know something. My Sarah has been reading to her grandmother every evening since she learned how. Last night she read from the Bible, and my mother cried because she finally understood what the words meant instead of just hearing them spoken. That's worth fighting for." As they approached the courthouse, Margaret could see that their group had grown. Workers from other businesses had joined the march, along with their wives and older children. The baker closed his shop and walked with them. The pharmacist locked his door and brought his whole family. Even some of the clerks from Preston Blackwood's own businesses had abandoned their posts to stand with their neighbors. By the time they reached the courthouse square, nearly 200 people had gathered, workers, families, small business owners, and children who understood that their future was being decided. They faced Preston Blackwood's armed riders across the square, but the dynamic had shifted dramatically. Preston himself sat on his horse at the edge of his formation, his face dark with disbelief and rage. He had expected to face a handful of federal marshals and frightened families cowering in the courthouse. Instead, he found himself confronting what appeared to be half the working population of Millbrook. Marshal Crawford emerged from the courthouse, his face showing relief and admiration as he surveyed the crowd that had gathered in support of Margaret's cause. "Mrs. Wheeler," he called out, "it appears you've managed to change the odds considerably." Margaret climbed the courthouse steps so that her voice would carry to everyone in the square, both supporters and opponents. "Preston Blackwood," she called out, her voice clear and strong, "you said that your authority comes from your control over this community's economic life. But look around you. The people who actually create that economic life are standing here with me." Preston's horse pranced nervously as he struggled to control both the animal and his own emotions. "This is insurrection. These people are employees, not partners. They have contracts, obligations. They have rights," Margaret replied. "The right to organize, the right to withdraw their labor, the right to support causes they believe in. Those rights are protected by federal law, Marshal Crawford." "That's correct, Mrs. Wheeler," Crawford announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Workers have the legal right to organize and to engage in collective action. Any attempt to prevent such action through violence or intimidation is a federal crime." The standoff had reached its crucial moment. Preston Blackwood faced a choice. He could order his men to attack, potentially sparking a battle that would bring massive federal intervention and national attention to his actions, or he could back down and accept that his absolute control over Millbrook was ending. As the tension mounted, a new voice cut through the air. "Preston, stand down!" Judge Henry Blackwood had emerged from the courthouse and was walking toward his brother, his judicial robes replaced by simple civilian clothes, but his authority undiminished. "Henry," Preston said through gritted teeth, "don't interfere in this. You don't understand what's at stake." "I understand perfectly," the judge replied. "You're willing to start a war to maintain a system that treats human beings as property. You're willing to shed blood to prevent children from learning to read. That's not order, Preston. That's tyranny." The two brothers faced each other, across the square, representing not just different viewpoints, but different visions of what America could become. Around them, the people of Millbrook waited to see which vision would prevail. Margaret Wheeler stood on the courthouse steps, surrounded by the community she had helped to awaken, and prepared for whatever came next. The chains that had once bound her to the oak tree were broken, but the struggle for freedom was far from over. The silence stretched across the courthouse square like a held breath. 200 townspeople stood united behind Margaret Wheeler, while 30 armed riders waited for Preston Blackwood's command. Between them, two brothers embodied the fundamental choice facing not just Millbrook, but communities across America. Clayton Hartwell, his patience finally exhausted, spurred his horse forward. "Enough talking! We came here to restore order, and that's what we're going to do." His hand moved toward his weapon, but before he could draw it, something unexpected happened. Jacob Morrison, the young deputy who had served under Hartwell, stepped directly into his path. "No," Morrison said simply, "I won't be part of this." Hartwell's face contorted with rage. "Get out of my way, boy, or you'll be the first to fall." But Morrison wasn't alone. Carl Brennan, the other local deputy, moved to stand beside him. Then Dr. Morrison stepped forward, followed by the town banker, the postal clerk, and dozens of other citizens who had remained neutral throughout the conflict. "Sheriff Hartwell," Dr. Morrison announced, "you're isolated. Look around you. Even your own men are refusing to follow orders that violate everything we claim to believe in as Americans." Preston Blackwood watched his carefully assembled force crumble before his eyes. The hired gunmen he had brought from outside the county shifted nervously in their saddles, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of firing on a crowd that included children and elderly residents. "This is your last chance, Henry," Preston said to his brother, desperation creeping into his voice. "Call off this mob before someone gets hurt." Judge Blackwood walked closer to his brother's horse, looking up at the man he had known for 67 years. "Preston, when we were children, you used to have nightmares about being powerless. You'd wake up crying, convinced that someone was going to take everything away from you. I see now that you never stopped having those nightmares." "This isn't about fear," Preston replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "This is about maintaining civilization, about preserving the order that allows society to function." "No," Margaret said, stepping down from the courthouse steps to stand between the brothers. "This is about one man's inability to accept that. The world is changing. Your order was built on the premise that some people matter less than others. That premise is false, and we're not going to pretend otherwise anymore." She turned to address Preston directly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced the worst he could offer and survived. "Mr. Blackwood, you can fire every worker in your employ. You can foreclose on every mortgage you hold. You can use every bit of economic power you possess to try to crush this movement. But you cannot unteach what has already been learned. You cannot make people forget that they have dignity and rights." Thomas stepped forward to stand beside his wife, his massive frame a symbol of the quiet strength that had carried them through every challenge. "The children in Margaret's school can read now, Mr. Blackwood. They can write, they can think for themselves. No amount of force will change that." Around the square, parents began calling their children to stand with them. Sarah, the mixed-race girl whose presence in Margaret's classroom had triggered the original confrontation, walked hand in hand with Emma Curtis. William Mason stood proudly beside his father. One by one, Margaret's former students gathered around her, living proof of what education could accomplish when offered freely and without prejudice. Preston Blackwood looked at the children and, for a moment, his hardened facade cracked. These weren't the dangerous radicals he had imagined in his fevered planning sessions. These were ordinary children, whose only crime was learning to read. "Sarah," he said quietly, addressing the young girl directly, "do you know who I am?" The child looked up at him with curious eyes. "You're Mr. Blackwood. My mama cleans your house sometimes." "Do you know why some people think you shouldn't be in school with the other children?" Sarah considered the question. with the seriousness only children can bring to complex issues. I think it's because they're scared. Mrs. Wheeler says people sometimes act mean when they're scared of things they don't understand. The simple wisdom of the child's response seemed to hit Preston like a physical blow. He sat back in his saddle, staring at this young girl who represented everything he had been fighting against, and saw not a threat but a future he couldn't control. "Mr. Blackwood," Marshal Crawford called out, "I'm giving you one final opportunity to surrender peacefully. You and your men are vastly outnumbered, and any violence here will result in federal charges that will follow you for the rest of your lives." For a long moment, Preston seemed to be weighing his options. Then slowly he dismounted from his horse. The gesture was so unexpected that the entire crowd held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. "Marshal Crawford," Preston said, his voice heavy with defeat, "I surrender myself to federal custody. The men with me were hired to protect property, not to engage in violence against federal officers." Clayton Hartwell's face turned purple with rage. "You coward! We had them outnumbered." "No," Preston replied sadly. "We never had them outnumbered. We were fighting against an entire community that had decided to stand together. Numbers don't matter when you're on the wrong side of history." As the federal marshals moved to take Preston into custody, the crowd began to disperse. But the victory celebration Margaret had expected didn't materialize. Instead, there was a somber recognition that change, even necessary change, came at a cost. Judge Blackwood approached Margaret as the square emptied. "Mrs. Wheeler, I want you to know that what happened here today will be remembered far beyond the borders of Millbrook. You've shown that ordinary people working together can overcome seemingly impossible odds." Margaret looked around the square, her eyes settling on the oak tree where she had been chained 6 months earlier. "Judge, I didn't set out to start a revolution. I just wanted to teach children to read." "Sometimes," he replied with a gentle smile, "that's how the most important revolutions begin." 5 years later, Margaret Wheeler stood in the main classroom of the Millbrook Institute for Democratic Education, watching her students work on their final examinations. The small schoolhouse had grown into a proper academy, with 3 buildings and teachers who came from as far away as Boston to study Margaret's methods. The workers' cooperative that had emerged from the lumber mill had become a model for similar enterprises throughout the region. Samuel Roberts served as its elected president, and the profits were shared among all the worker owners, according to both their labor and their needs. Sarah, now 13, was preparing to attend the state university on a scholarship funded by the cooperative. Emma Curtis had written a book about her experiences in Margaret's original classroom. William Mason was apprenticing with his father, while also studying engineering through correspondence courses. Thomas still worked at his forge, but now he also taught metalworking classes at the Institute. His students included children from across the social spectrum, all learning that skilled labor deserved the same respect as any other profession. On the wall of Margaret's office hung a small bronze plaque, a gift from the federal government recognizing her contributions to civil rights and education. But the item she treasured most was a simple letter from Sarah, written in the careful script Margaret had taught her years earlier. "Dear Mrs. Wheeler, thank you for teaching me that being smart is not something to hide. Thank you for showing me that everyone deserves to learn. Thank you for being brave when the rest of us were scared. Love, Sarah." As Margaret locked the schoolhouse door that evening and walked home through the familiar streets of Millbrook, she reflected on how much had changed. The oak tree in the square now had a small reading garden around its base, where children gathered on warm afternoons to share stories and dreams. The chains that had once bound her to that tree were displayed in the town museum, a reminder of what happened when fear and prejudice were allowed to override justice and human dignity. But more importantly, they served as proof that even the Strongest chains could be broken when people decided to stand together. Margaret Wheeler had been chained to a tree for teaching children to read. But Thomas Wheeler had said, "Unchain my wife," and a community had found the courage to break more than just iron links. They had broken the chains of ignorance, fear, and hatred that had bound them all. And in doing so, they had discovered that freedom, once tasted, was something worth any sacrifice to preserve. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.